Hi, everyone, and welcome to the course of World History. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are going to be looking at imperialism with a focus on East Asia. That's this area right here. So let's dive into our essential question. Which Western powers colonized Southeast Asia, and why did they do it? Let's start with a quick review of new imperialism. The 1880s, late 1870s, but really by 1880s, we're seeing this shift in the type of imperialism that's being used by Western nations. Now, prior to the 1880s, the West had really focused on controlling trade routes and trading and ports. They didn't push their control much inland. It was enough to be making money, and really was merchants who were kind of the face of the empire. But after the 1880s, Western empires are now pushing out and seeking control of the land. It's about the natural resources and the labor that's available. That's now what is being sought by the Western powers. And you can see it becomes quite a land grab on their part. Now, what are their motives? Why are they doing this? A big one is economics. Imperialism was really this race to control industrial raw materials. So they wanted to control, for example, in Indochina, modern Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, they want to control rubber so that they can bring that rubber back to their nations and build stuff with it. Racism was a big factor. Westerners believed that racial superiority meant that they were destined to rule. They even created this whole fake science called phrenology that measured people's skulls and tried to use skull measurements to figure out intelligence. Of course, they chose the white European skull as the model of the best, and anything that didn't match it exactly was seen as a deficit to those people. It was all fake science. There's nothing to back this up. And yet it was used by some to promote the idea of white superiority. The last one is Christianity. Some believe that Westerners had this moral responsibility to Christianize and civilize the world. Some nations, some leaders really truly believe this. Others saw it as a convenient excuse. We're going to go civilize the nation. And in the meantime, we're going to take all their resources. But we're there to civilize them. These were the three main reasons that were given. Now let's look at the British and what they're doing. The British control in Southeast Asia really begins in 1819 with the colony of Singapore. Up till then, again, they'd really just been involved in trade and trade routes. Singapore becomes their first real colony, and it was conveniently placed right down here to control trade from China. Now, once Britain had that control, and once they'd gotten fully kind of into this imperial mindset, they next overthrow the monarchy in Burma. Burma is this country right here. It is modern Myanmar. And they use this control of this territory to really make sure that India is protected from any potential Chinese or French influence throughout that region. Myanmar was this buffer, but it later gets rolled into the greater British Indian government. All right, the French. After the British took over Burma, the French get serious about imperial control of the region. They're not just going to be lightly controlling things as they had in Vietnam for some time. They're now going to rapidly expand their influence and control of the region. Now, to halt these British moves eastward, France first convinced Vietnam to invite in more French troops. They say, hey, invite us in. We're going to be your protectors. We're going to make sure that your nation is safe from what these other nations are trying to do. By 1884, the French military is there, and they just kind of switch their mission. It's now not about protecting Vietnam, it's about controlling Vietnam. And they then expand outward into Cambodia and into Laos and some other territories as well, Tonkin and so on. These are not countries that currently exist, and expand their control. They will then, in 1887, unify all of these territories under one French colonial government, and just call that territory French Indochina. Right, Thailand. Thailand is an exception to the rule. It's actually one of just a few nations in the world that were never deeply controlled by Europeans. Thailand, which was then called Siam, is that only Southeast Asian nation to remain independent. King Mongkut, this guy right here, promotes the idea of Western learning. It's like, hey, you guys are doing something right. This is smart. This is good. We're gonna do what you're doing, which kind of takes away the idea that Europeans have to come in and civilize them. Like, no. We're civilizing ourselves. Thank you for the lessons you're teaching us. We're gonna do what you're doing. We're civilized. And then he really works to be friendly with both the British and the French, these two powerful imperial neighbors that are taking over territory. So he's doing everything that the British and French want him to do without being asked, and he's being friendly with both of them. He manages to convince them by 1896 to agree that an independent Siam is good for both of them. It's going to create a buffer. Both nations were a little bit worried that if their colonies were to collide, it might lead to warfare. It had in the past, right? The British and French fought over the Ohio Valley when their North American colonies collided. Here they could avoid that with an independent Siam. And so Siam, Thailand, remains an independent territory, never colonized, never dominated by foreign powers. All right, the United States. What is the United States doing in the region? Well, in 1898, the United States got involved in a splendid little war that was, quote from President McKinley, the Spanish-American War. This is where America really launches itself into a premier spot as a world power. We take on the Spanish Empire. We crush the Spanish Empire. In 4 months, we absolutely, punish them in the Caribbean. And we sneak up and we catch them off guard in the Philippines as well. So the Philippine Islands in Southeast Asia, which had been a Spanish colony, gets captured by the United States. And we decide, why let you be independent? You were a Spanish colony. You're used to being a colony. Now you can just be our colony instead. And then we can use this, the United States said, as a launching off point for trade with China. It's just off the shore of China. We know China's got a huge market, lots of people. We can sell them a lot of goods if we just have a staging point nearby. This will be a good place to keep the U.S. Navy. It will be a good place to store our goods while we wait to trade with China. It'll be good to have. Let's take it. Because, the United States said, if we don't, somebody else will. This is a period where Japan is going through some rapid territorial expansion. They've captured some islands off the Chinese coast. They're about to really whoop on the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. Japan is not an insignificant power. They're looking to expand. If we don't take the Philippines, maybe they will. So, convenient excuse maybe, but let's keep the Philippines. All right, so how are these colonies ruled? There are two ways, and it's either by indirect rule or direct rule. And we're going to talk about both of them, starting with indirect rule. Now, indirect rule winds up being preferred because it's cheaper. It's much less expensive to just let a country govern themselves than to try to come in and forcefully impose our will. So in indirect rule, local leaders get to keep their authority, right? The mayors of major cities, the governors of territories, those remain indigenous people, but they have to do what the colonizing power, the imperial power, says. They are a puppet government. We say jump, you say how high. And we'll make sure you get to keep your position, and we'll make sure you keep your prestige, your wealth. Things will go well for you. Now, indirect rule did require that the elite, the puppets, agreed to have their strings pulled. If they didn't, that's what direct rule is about. When local leaders fought against the imperial powers, when local leaders started to say, no, I'm not going to do that, then direct rule replaces it. With direct rule, local leaders, they get ousted. Sometimes they get exiled, just kicked out of the country. Sometimes they get executed. But in any place with direct rule, you remove the local leaders from their positions of authority. You put in people from your own country to govern um, in all high national offices, all provincial offices, and all top military jobs. Those are all going to be held by people from your country so that you can really have a firm control over what's going on. All right, so colonial economies, what's going on here? The territories controlled by Western powers were not allowed to develop their own industries. These were places for raw materials, and that is what they existed for. Colonial governments ensured that the lands focused only on exporting raw materials. So in Indochina, they produced rubber. They exported rubber. And then that rubber was turned into things in France. They are focused purely on developing raw materials. We don't want industry in those places, said the colonial governments, because then that industry would compete with our own. Raw materials only was the way to go. We make the manufactured goods. Wages are kept very low, poverty limits. The idea is to keep people just from starving. You don't want your workforce to completely starve. You want them to be able to do their work. But any other resource, any other wealth you extract out of the country and you take it with you. And that way you can maximize profits. The Western empires did come in and do some positive things, as I'd mentioned in a previous lesson. They do invest in roads, they invest in railroads. They're doing this for selfish reasons. Do not get that wrong. But there is going to be a lasting positive impact out of some of those investments. All right, resistance. Believe it or not everybody loved this kind of Western imperialism. Throughout the region, there is going to be resistance against the British, against the French, against the Americans. We didn't talk as much about the Dutch, but the Dutch are over in modern Indonesia doing the same thing, and there's resistance all over the place. Now, early resistance does tend to come from the existing power structure. It's the people who were governors that didn't want to be puppets, and they fight back. But modern industrialism means that these imperial powers can really overwhelm the existing power structures. Plus, the people who currently held power largely weren't very popular, and therefore it was relatively easy to defeat these existing power structures. But over time, a new generation grows up in this imperial system. This new generation, especially those who've been able to work their way into the middle class, especially under indirect rule, but also under direct rule, become educated. They learn Western ways, and they want to apply Western ways to their own country in a way that the Western governments aren't letting them do it. And they become the center of the new wave of resistance movements. We'll certainly talk more about that new wave of resistance movements. This is an example of one of those leaders. Sayasan was a leader in Burma, the revolutions, the revolts against the British. They had, I believe it was 3 major ones before the British finally left. But we'll get to that once we get to the national movements following World War II. That is all for today. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and farewell.